20 minutes overall, 15 for the talk, and about 5, I mean, not for questions, but I mean, it's flexible, but not more than 20 overall, okay? Thank you very much. Please.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Can you see my slides okay?
We do.
Okay, great. So this talk is about the construction of a fluid structure interaction model of the human heart. This is going to be the entire human heart, so all 4 chambers, all 4 valves, and also some of the great vessels. It's something that I started working with when I was a postdoc with Boyce Griffith. Many people have worked on this, and so I wanted to acknowledge them here. I mean, this is a collaboration of many people. And so with that, I'd like to begin. I also have some, or we have some additional collaborators. The actual imaging data from which this model is derived is from Duke Radiology. So we have some computed tomography data that we got the model geometries from. And then I spent the last 2 years at NYU working with Charlie Peskin and Dave McQueen. They also have their own immersed boundary heart model that they've been working on for quite a while. And so comparing notes with them has been quite helpful. Okay, so I first want to talk about exactly how we're doing the fluid structure interaction. We're doing it using a version of the immersed boundary method, where the solid displacements and forces are represented on a finite element mesh. And so this is sort of a high-level overview of the numerical approach that we have. So there's some reference configuration of an immersed structure, U. There's a motion map, which takes this reference configuration and pushes it forward to the current configuration at time t. So that's called chi. Chi is what we want to approximate numerically. We have Lagrangian coordinates big X and Eulerian coordinates small x. And the model that we're working with is defined by this total Cauchy stress here. Can you see my pointer, by the way?
At the moment, no. Can you move it? Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Because I may circle some things or point at some things. So we have this total Cauchy stress. This is our model. It's broken up into 2 parts. There's a Newtonian fluid stress sigma F that exists everywhere in the computational domain omega. So here's our computational domain here. And then in the current configuration of the solid, there's some elastic Cauchy stress that's active, but that's only in the current configuration of the solid. So our model overall in the current configuration of the solid is a superposition of a fluid and solid stress. And so there's some viscoelasticity that's given from the background fluid in this model. Some additional notation here. The first Piola-Kirchhoff stress is related to the elastic Cauchy stress through this transformation. F is a deformation gradient, J is a determinant of the deformation gradient. So if you start from this model and work with the principle of virtual work. So from the principle of virtual work, you can get these equations of motion. In this immersed boundary framework, we have one momentum equation. So we have the Navier-Stokes equations, but they're augmented by an additional force density F on the right-hand side that describes the forces that the solid exerts on the fluid. I'll talk about that in 2 seconds, but we have the incompressibility constraint everywhere. So the solid and the fluid are incompressible. And then this force density that the solid exerts on the fluid is described right here. So it's broken up into 2 parts. There's a volumetric force density. That's a divergence of the stress, the PK1 stress. And then we have a surface force density as well. So we have a singular force layer as well on the fluid structure interface. This is what you get, coming out of the principle of virtual work. And then there's one more equation here, and that is a no slip and no penetration between the fluid and the solid. So in other words, the solid is not pore elastic in this model. So what this last equation says is that the velocity of the solid d chi dt is equal to the velocity of the background fluid. And so this is sort of the standard immersed boundary framework where in these last 2 equations, we have Dirac delta function kernels, which allow us to move between the Lagrangian and Eulerian frames. And so this is sort of the magic of the immersed boundary method. It allows us to sort of very easily handle large deformations, especially the heart valves. Okay, so very briefly, some numerical details. I mean, this certainly is not comprehensive, but just to give you some ideas. So the actual momentum equation itself is approximated by the marker and cell scheme on a fixed Cartesian grid. The grid can be locally refined. In our case, we do local refinement around the current configuration of the immersed structure. So what I'm showing here on the bottom left is a slice of the model itself through the computational domain. So the black and white is a Cartesian grid. You can see local refinement of the grid around the structure. The colored part here is actually the immersed structure itself. So what we're looking at is a slice through the left ventricle in red and then the ascending aorta in magenta. So for the structures themselves, we have unstructured TET meshes. And so that's what I'm showing here on the bottom right. This is actually zooming in to the aorta, the ascending aorta, looking down at the aortic valve. The reason why I wanted to show this figure is that we're also able to do local refinement on the finite element mesh, on the finite element structural mesh. And in this picture here, the aortic valve is actually refined one step with respect to the overall mesh. So we have a locally refined aortic valve. We're using first order Lagrange FE basis functions, finite element basis functions everywhere. The numerical implementation is done in IB-AMR. So this is an open source framework for many different types of immersed boundary methods. The AMR stands for adaptive mesh refinement, so of the fluid in particular. So it allows you to have it locally refined fluid discretizations. And it heavily relies on other open source software, so like Samurai, LibMesh, and PETC. And here's a link to the IB-AMR GitHub. A couple comments on where the actual finite element discretization comes into play. So what I'm showing here on this slide is actually how we compute, use the finite elements to compute the force density that the solid exerts on the fluid. And so actually coming down to the second equation first. So we compute a representation of the Lagrangian force density on the volumetric finite element basis functions by doing an L2 projection of that force density. So if you were to think about integrating this term on the right by parts, you would have the divergence of the stress minus that surface force density term that we saw in the equations of motion. So what we do is we do an L2 projection of that force density onto the volumetric basis functions. We get a Lagrangian force density big G. So this is a force density sitting on the finite element mesh. We then convert that Lagrangian force density to an Eulerian force density using the Dirac delta function kernel. And that Eulerian force density can then be put on the right-hand side of the Navier-Stokes equations and used used in whatever numerical scheme that you have for that momentum equation. And by the way, the restriction of the fluid velocity of the solid is at the discrete level is a discrete adjoint of the operations that I said verbally on this slide here. So there's a step where you spread the forces from the solid to the fluid and you restrict the velocity from the fluid to the solid. And that velocity restriction from the fluid to the solid is a discrete adjoint of what I'm describing here. Okay, now going into model construction itself. Like I said at the beginning, our models are derived from medical imaging data, CT data or computed tomography data that we can segment fairly easily in open source software. We can do it semi-automatically. And what we get from that is a faceted surface file or an STL file. And then after we get that STL file, the sort of model construction process varies quite a bit depending on exactly what we're doing. But generically, what we do is some sort of smoothing. We may do some thickening of the geometries. I'll emphasize this again, but all our geometries are volumetric, even the valves. We don't have any surface geometries in our model. So we're gonna have to do some thickening if we have valves or if we have a vessel that we wanna thicken to a certain width. And then we develop these unstructured TET meshes either in qubit or trellis, or what's worked really well for us recently is TETwild. So this is an open source software for, you basically give it a bunch of STL files and it'll give you an unstructured TET mesh. It worked really well for our model. And so this is a TETwild GitHub that I've attached on this slide here. All right, in terms of elastic responses of solids, so I want to talk about the constitutive models that we're actually using for the immersed structures. They're broken up into two parts. There's a passive part, a passive stress, and an active stress. We assume our solids are hyperelastic, so the stress is derived from a strain energy density. In this case, the strain energy density depends on two vector fields or fiber directions. if we're talking about the myocardium, those fiber directions are the muscle fiber orientation and the collagen sheet orientation. In our models, we also, the way we get things moving and contracting is through an active stress formulation. And our active stress formulation depends on all three fiber directions. I'll get to that in a few slides. And before I talk about the elastic constitutive models in more detail, I just want to give you a picture of what the subdomains of our model, our constructed model, look like within the computational domain. So what we're looking at here is the fluid mesh. It's a box, a cube, and you can see the local refinement of the fluid mesh around the structure. And then the colored things are the actual heart model itself. So the yellow is the pulmonary artery, which branches into two separate left and right branch. The red is the left ventricle, green is the right ventricle, magenta is the ascending aorta. And if I make some things transparent here, you can see the valves in our model. So we have the aortic and pulmonic outflow valves, and also the mitral and tricuspid valves with volumetric representations of the chordae and papillary muscles. Everything is volumetric in our model. This is really important so that we can actually describe things with realistic anisotropic stresses. Okay, so in terms of what we're using for...
Keep an eye on time.
Keep an eye on time.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. How much time do I have left? About eight minutes? I'll continue quickly.
At most.
Okay, so we have 4 different passive constitutive models. A neo-Hookean for the great vessels and cardiac skeleton. We use an HO model for the heart myocardium, depending on 2 fiber directions, as I mentioned previously. The chordae, we're using a nonlinear spring model that depends on I4 cubed. And for the heart valves, we have a biaxial fung-type model. The reason why we're using this fung-type model for the valves is because we have a paper from which we can get data for the parameters. It's actually derived from human data for all 4 valves. So that's why we're using this fung-type model. Our active stress is sort of like a standard active stress formulation, and it's given here. Just as sort of an anecdotal comment, we initially tried to do an active stress only in the muscle fiber direction, and we ended up getting very strange ventricular deformations. But adding an active stress in the other 2 fiber directions as well really helped our ventricular deformations look more physiologic. And we do sort of a standard isovolumetric dilational split of the stress. So we take our passive and active stresses, do a DV torque projection, and add a volumetric part that penalizes compressible deformations of the structure. This is really important. Otherwise, our elements in our valves and our myocardium start inverting pretty quickly. So this volumetric stress is quite important for us. I want to really emphasize that our models are calibrated with human data. We're either calibrating our stresses with human data or taking them from literature, where the literature has calibrated these with human data. So I'm showing a stress strain curve where we fit that nonlinear spring model to some data for some of the mitral chordae. And on the right, I'm actually showing the fibers that we're using for the valves. So those are the 4 valves, and looking at the fibers for the chordae, papillary muscles, and the 4 valves. We're using a Poisson interpolation approach, so where we solve a sequence of harmonic problems on the finite element mesh. And I think many other people have talked about this type of approach in this conference. So now for some videos. So this is just a visualization of the fibers in our model along with the subdomains. So the colors correspond to different subdomains. And you'll see right at the end of this video, we'll cut away so you can see the inside of the heart along with the valves. Okay. Okay, briefly, we need boundary conditions on our model as well. For outflow boundary conditions, we use a 3-element Wink-Kessel model. These are at the outflow valves, or outflow vessels rather. The outflow vessels are extended to the boundary of the computational domain, where we impose boundary conditions for these 3-element Wink-Kessel models. Things are done in a partitioned way, so we feed the flow to the Wink-Kessel models, use that to update the pressure. That pressure is imposed as a traction boundary condition on the FSI model. We also need some way for things to fill in diastole, and so For that, we have pressure-driven fluid sources, which are sitting within the atria at the moment. And I can elaborate more on that. The last boundary condition that's important is we do have a model for the pericardium. It's a surface force density imposed on the epicardium that acts in the direction of the current normal vector, the normal vector in the current configuration on the epicardium. There's a spring-like force, and there's also a dampening force as well that depends on the velocity of the epicardium. Okay, so now I want to finish my talk just with some initial simulations of a cardiac cycle, the model that I've just described. This is looking at the velocity field, a slice of the velocity field on the left side of the heart, along with the aortic valve and mitral valve. Okay, and then this is looking at the same perspective, but the magnitude of the velocity field. And I can come back and we can look at these in more detail, but let me go ahead and get to the end of my talk. So this is looking at deformation of all four valves. I can make comments about you know, how I feel about these deformations now, but let me first finish. And so this is looking at the aortic valve deformations. The reason why I wanted to focus on this is because you can see that there's some nice fluttering of the leaflets when the valves open. This fluttering was achieved when we actually did local refinement of the aortic valve mesh. Our aortic valve was really sort of numerically stenotic, and doing local refinement of that helped the deformations a lot. And then this is looking at a PV loop of our model. If you hadn't already guessed from looking at the deformations, this is sort of one of my editorial comments about our model. Our contraction, ventricular contraction, is very weak. And you can see that in our PV loop that we have. So our ejection fraction is about 30%. And so what we're working on now is tuning the active stress, active tension parameters so that we have stronger ventricular contraction. And so I'd like to end here, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles, for the nice overview about this immersed boundary approach. Any questions from the chat or from the audience? In case I have a, okay, there is one.
Paolo.
Yes. Just a comment in the chat. So wonderful results. Any question?
Yes, Paolo, I'm Christian Vergara. I have a question.
Yes.
For Charles. Can you hear me?
Yes,
I can. Yeah,
yes.
sorry, my
Thank
GPU
you.
is very loud right now, but I can't hear you.
Interesting talk. I have just a curiosity about the managing of the isovolumic phase in this last movie and simulation you're showing. Are there any specific technique to manage this to account for the incompressibility of fluid? Thanks.
Yeah, are you talking about actually computing pressure volume loops from the model, or are you talking about numerically dealing with incompressibility of the fluid? I just want to make sure.
Correctly, Christian, question if it's about the second point that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, the marker and cell scheme has discrete incompressibility of the fluid built into it. The problem is when you take the velocity field and restrict it to the immersed boundary, to the immersed structure, you lose discrete incompressibility. We try to reinforce that by having this volumetric energy, and that helps a lot. If I didn't have the volumetric energy, elements would almost automatically start inverting in the myocardium. So that's how we enforce incompressibility of the solid. Of the fluid, it's handled at the numerical level.